I'm very happy to be joined by Celia Clarke now. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and as you can see, we're surrounded by a lot of Tricorn paraphernalia, pretty much all of which is yours. Tell me a bit about yourself, first of all.
I've lived in Portsmouth since 1970 and I'm married to an architect. I have two architect children, one of whom trained here. And basically, I didn't make it as an architect, but I've always been very interested in architecture and also sculpture. And to me, the Tricorn was a giant sculpture. It just figured on the skyline and images of Portsmouth. And a naval officer said to me once, when I spotted the Tricorn from my ship, I knew I was home.
Golly, and you've written this book, which is here we are, it's the Tricorn, the life and death of a 60s icon. And it's very popular, you were telling me.
Yes, some friends actually formed Tricorn Books. They'd never been publishers before, but they're in the High Street in Old Portsmouth. So they said, let's be publishers. So this is their first book, and it's been printed 4 times so far. I've sold about 800 copies, still selling.
Wow.
And the idea of the book was partly to describe how the Tricorn came to be built and designed, and then what happened inside, illegal or legal, and then the fight to save it, which we ultimately lost. And then there's now a chapter of 11 years, what's happening to the site now.
Well, it's safe to say that you are a real advocate, or you were a real advocate of the Tricorn. Can you tell me why? What was the biggest appeal for you, and why does it have this power over people?
It's a good question, and it's actually a quite complicated answer. One of the answers is to do with the fact that one of the architects, Owen Luder, actually understood that it was important to layer city functions one on top of the other, particularly in a city like Portsmouth, which is so short of land because it's an island. And he realised that he could have shops, retail on the ground floor, wholesale on the first floor, some flats, clubs, and the car park, all on top of each other. And it hadn't been done in this country before, so it was a first. So that's one reason, which is to do with the ingenuity of land use.
Yes.
Secondly, I think, as I've said, it's because it was a giant sculpture, and all those extraordinary shapes, the skyline of it, and the experience of actually going inside it. It's like an enormous concrete honeycomb.
Concrete honeycomb.
Yes, and I think the other reason was it had potential to be converted to something else, and that's the bit where we were not able to get people to listen to the reuse designs that we had. For example, Kate McIntosh and Mick Morris, two local architects, designed flats in it, right? And Mick Morris wanted to transform it by the top part having a cafe, with a viewing on it, because that was about 7-8 stories high, with a cascade of greenery down it, in a glass greenhouse. We could all sit up there and enjoy the view. And that would have been perfectly possible, and it's been done in other places.
So you must be still very disappointed that it did get demolished.
Well, I think it was utterly stupid. If you think about the principle of sustainability, one of those is to save the embodied energy of buildings, right? By reusing them for something else if necessary, which is, that requires even more ingenuity than designing from the beginning, as a new build. And so to waste all those thousands of tons of concrete and steel, as well as all the accumulated associations the building had, because there are thousands of us who really still love the building, even though it's been dead for 11 years. From that point of view, it was terribly wasteful, and even more infuriating is to leave the site empty all this time.
Of course. Well, you talked about it as well as being a giant sculpture. And what we have here is your interpretation that you've made a sculpture of the Tricorn.
Well, that's just the Kissing Towers, which are also on Claire Sandbrook's
let's talk about some of these things as well.
Yeah.
So this deck chair, this one was from Claire Sandbrook?
Yes, I think it's the Tricorn bleeding. I think.
Oh yes.
Yes.
I don't know if we can see here. It's got great colours. Great colours.
It's a marvellous thing, isn't it? I was so thrilled. because there's only one of these, and my friends bought it for me.
That's terrific. And you're also adorned with some of the tricorn as well.
That's by Claire as well. Claire and Mick Morris together did that. Yeah.
So it really does inspire art. Do you think that's also part of the appeal, or it was part of the appeal?
I think if you look at paintings of it as well, by Richard Crabb and other people, and literally, I should say, hundreds of students, right? Students of film or video or photography, who used it as their dissertation project. If you looked at the exhibition that we had at the City Museum last year, there's a tremendous amount of flowering, and it's still flowering. I can't believe it, but I mean, a guy who never saw the building saw the pictures, and he's doing prints of it.
I think I actually own one of those. Actually, I've got one of those in the house. Do you think that there's an element of it's like a banned film? Once something's gone, or people aren't allowed to see it anymore, it develops a kind of cult status. Do you believe that the tricorn has got that element to it?
Yes, it probably has. It's still there in people's imaginations. That's the point.
Yes.
And it absolutely refuses to die. I mean, when we had the exhibition last year, people were allowed to vote for or against. Should it have been kept or shouldn't it? And they use these little plastic orange discs, coins. And there was a visitor's book. Okay, kids scrawled in it, but also some quite cogent comments were made. It's something like that. I don't know what it is, but one of the original architects is still alive, and he designed another building in Portsmouth, the Mercantile House.
Yes.
Which is round the corner from here.
Yeah.
And has this wonderful triangular staircase. I made a sculpture of that too. It's really quite beautiful. Apparently it's rather dizzy making if you actually go up and down it.
Yes.
Because you keep on turning a corner.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned other buildings of this sort and the architect,
yes,
there are plenty of other buildings around the UK that are very similar to the tricorn.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about that?
Some
examples.
Well, for example, a building by the same developer is the Brunswick Centre in Camden,
Yeah.
right? Which was actually a ziggurat, so you can imagine there's an hatching bit on the other side, and that was originally council flats. And it had shops, down below, and it got into a very, very run-down state. It's by a different architect. This is by Patrick Hodgkin, whereas the Tricorn's by the Owen Luder partnership. But the developer was the same.
Yes.
He obviously had an enthusiasm for megastructures, because that's what these are. And fairly recently, it's had a renaissance. The clue is that it was made a listed building, whereas we failed to get the Tricorn listed.
And that would have bought you some more time to maybe...
And now it's a really smart area with, posh shops down the bottom. Quite a lot of the flats sold off.
Beside Russell Square Underground Station in London, I recognise it.
And one that actually is on its way down, unfortunately, is this one, Robin Hood Gardens, which is in Poplar in East London.
Yeah.
That's two great arms of blocks of flats with a lovely green space in the middle with a hill and a lot of artwork. And it's by the Alison and Peter Smithson, who are the absolute doyens of brutalist architecture. There's the shape, see? So it's like two arms holding a green hill, which is really beautiful, I think.
You mentioned a word there that I think is worth talking about, brutalist architecture. Yes. Can you tell me what that is, what would define that, and also the tricorn would be called that, is that correct?
Yes, and I think the answer is quite complicated. Basically, it's nothing to do with being brutal. Remember that, right? It's to do with béton brut, which means raw concrete. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a kind of pleasure in the texture. So this book, for example,
pleasure in the texture of
the
cover, even.
Yes. So how you achieve that is in brutalist buildings is that a very skilled team of carpenters make an armature of planks, right? The concrete's cast against the planks, and so you've got an echo of wood in the concrete.
Is the National Theatre on the South Bank, is that made of that kind of material?
Yes, it is, and in fact that's by Dennis Laston, and obviously, so a lot of these brutalist buildings are absolutely loved, you know,
Yes.
and I went to the National Theatre 2 weeks ago, and inside there's quite a lot of panels which are really rough still, and they've lit them artfully, so you can see that texture. It's not flat.
Yeah.
You know, that I think makes them absolutely fascinating.
And it makes a love-hate kind of relationship, doesn't it? Which exists and existed for the Tricorn as well. This, you either love it or hate it. I take it you love it.
Well, yes, because it's partly because it's very expressive, you know. For example, where you've got a hood at the top of a staircase, right, that keeps the rain off. So the functions are very clear, and I think that's and also they're quite heroic. If you look at that stair, it's a very, very interesting form, but it also works.
Well, that's another point, because architecture is about not just doors, windows and stairs.
Yes.
It's about perhaps a social element to it as well. And what purpose did the Tricorn have for the people of Portsmouth, and did it work?
Well, the answer is yes and no. I mean, the yes part is obviously, one thing it did was sheltered the Charlotte Street Market, and I never was quite sure why it actually didn't move inside. But it was on the southern edge, and people did live there, but the flats were so badly designed that they were horribly damp, and that's because the architect didn't realise that when you design in concrete, you must have a ledge above the window or door which throws off the rain. If you, if you look at those blocks of flats over there, they'd done it in the opposite way by sinking the windows in.
Yeah, the windows are back
right,
in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, whereas in the Tricorn it was all flush, which wasn't a good idea.
Okay.
So people did live there, and at the market, and then and the car parking obviously was very, very important to the city centre, which is why it was there. And those curving trays were echoed in the Barbican later on. So it was very influential in architectural terms. And I used to go down to the Charlotte Street Market every week. It was pretty well the only time I had off when I was a full-time mother, was to go and get the fruit and veg on Fridays. There, you know, we had political demonstrations inside it. I can remember manning a woman's lib stall there in the 70s. You know, they were very, very favourite shops, like, you know, the safari shop, if you wanted to go and get, you know, camping gear and that kind of thing. So, and actually on the first floor, it was used, there was a wholesale fruit and veg market. The problem was that the spiral ramps became too small as lorries got bigger.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, basically they should have been replaced. And one of the problems was that there wasn't any investment in updating it, because every building, every 25 years or so, ought to be, you know, all the services ought to be renewed or reviewed anyway. So that was a problem. But so that there were these double height warehouses, and when they stopped being warehouses, they were used for various arts activities. So the sculptor John Thompson, for example, built an enormous metal book for a Portsmouth Festival one year up there. Yeah. And I also saw a ballet performed there, and it had a kind of clear story inside this warehouse space. And they had choristers from the Portsmouth Cathedral singing, and then all these people dancing down below. It was really bizarre.
Oh, goodness. And I mean, you've touched on it there. The building houses a lot of memories for people, and you have your own. And have you heard in writing this, in collaborating with this book, you must have heard all sorts of stories that people have memories and times in their lives that they relate to the building.
Well, Owen Luder says his favourite is someone wrote in and said, conceive my seventh in there. It must have been rather uncomfortable. The thing is that to continue the idea of it being an inspiration to artists, obviously Jeannie Driver organised the last artwork and it was called The Art is on the Inside, I think it was called. And basically she got permission from Mars to use Marmite jars for Love It or Hate It, right? And people wrote up what they thought, and you'll find some in there, about what they thought about it. You know, the most fantastic car park in the universe, and I hated the place as well. So
why do you think some of these buildings that are the brutalist, the concrete kind of buildings all across the UK, why do some manage to continue to exist and don't get targeted to be brought down, and some...
Well, I think I'd like to start off by quoting Prince Charles, right?
Oh, well, yes, why not? Prince Charles, royalty quotes about the Tricorn.
Yes, well, in this case, I'd rather he hadn't. But he actually, someone contacted him and said, the Tricorn Centre, Portsmouth, someone round here once called it mildewed elephant droppings covered in drain pipes. It was...
Oh, that's
it was
quite damning.
Catherine Gladys, right?
Oh.
I don't know who she is,
no.
but there's a not very flattering picture of it there. So that's, you know, that's one point of view, that a lot of these brutalist buildings are ugly,
yes.
And bulky and a bit like Incredible Hulks, you know, and a lot of people in the UK maybe don't like concrete.
Yeah,
I think they should, but they don't.
It's a very specific taste, like olives.
And also, as I've said, Tricorn wasn't maintained properly.
So it didn't help itself in
well,
its
no,
existence.
the owners didn't look after it.
Yeah.
And what's more, the City Council lawyer gave them permission not to look after it. And that wasn't known to the councillors, but nobody knew why it was. They hadn't patched where the reinforcing had come to the surface and so on. And originally they were going to plant it too, which would have looked lovely with greenery coming over the tops of the trays. But I think when we applied to English Heritage to list it, the reasons they gave for refusing to list it were utterly specious. They said basically it's because socially undesirable activities took place in it.
Okay.
And is that a reason to list or not list a building?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so. No.
Especially as we had plans for people to live in it, you know, maisonettes.
And as you
so
say,
on.
a waste when you have all this concrete to just
Yes.
demolish something, and it is just right now a car park. Do you think that then, is it fated to remain a car park with just the ghost of the Tricorn forever?
Well, all I can say is that it doesn't show much about Portsmouth planners or the developers who have an option on it, that they haven't managed to produce anything on the site in 11 years.
Yes.
And we don't hear even echoes of what they do plan to do. But it's quite clear that the plans for reuse, which had got planning permission, right, which were a mixture of shops and housing and car park, clearly won't work anymore because the energy of shopping is all moving towards the waterfront. I think energy of the whole city is, if you look at Gum Wharf and what might happen in the dockyard as well, and the revamping of the Hard. Clearly shopping is not going to work there anymore because Commercial Road is in trouble, and well, I was told that by the Deputy Leader of the Council last week. But so I mean, it's much more obvious to me that we need to tackle things that Portsmouth need. Probably doesn't need any more shops, but it does need places for people to live, and there are people on the waiting list. So and you know, there are plenty of housing associations who would be prepared to develop it in that way. So, and people are moving back into city centres. They already have in Portsmouth. Chandos House used to be John Brown's engineering office, and now it's flats. So I think, you know, fairly high density housing is what's needed there. But in the meantime, we do have a project to green the edges because Ben Ainsley coming.
Yes,
right.
It's a big deal.
I think the politicians have got the message that it doesn't look very good. It's taken them 11 years to realise that.
11 years and Ben Ainsley to get some nice greenery around the area.
And so the Shore Trust are going to actually make planters and put trees and shrubs in them along the edge.
That'll be nice.
Designed by the city landscape architect Vincent Mount, who's brilliant, who designed the rather nice grassy bit that goes along and you know, going out of the city with those lovely grasses and bits of rock and stuff. It's supposed to be a kind of beach.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's doing something similar down along the edge there.
Good.
We've got to raise quite a lot more money once the first phase is built.
Okay.
But they're in a hurry now because it's July, isn't it?
Yes, the America's Cup comes.
Yeah.
Well, Celia, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for bringing in everything that you have, the books and your sculpture and the deck chair.
Thanks.
And I don't think there's a better person to have spoken to about the Tricorn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.